Wearing a watch can be the perfect accessory to complement a well put together person. However, when we are wearing a watch that is too big for our wrist, it can have the opposite effect. What's going on, everybody? My name is Baldassarre, and in this video we're going to be discussing everything you really need to know when it comes to how your watch should fit on your wrist. Whether your watch is too small, too big, how it is sliding up and down your wrist, we're going to cover all the basics, things that you need to consider so that you can have a watch that fits you well. So guys, without further ado, let's jump into it. So to start out this video, we first have to look at probably the most crucial element when considering all of the factors that factor into how your watch is going to fit, and that is your wrist size. Despite wanting a lot of larger watches, I know that they just would not look right on my smaller wrist. First, before you really pull the trigger on any watch, you should know your wrist size and should try on watches of different sizes to understand what looks best on you. Myself, as an example, I have a rather small wrist. I have a wrist of 6.25 inches, and understanding your wrist size is going to be incredibly beneficial when buying watches, especially considering that many of us are buying watches online and we're not actually able to try on all the watches that we're purchasing. So after you determine your wrist size, there's a few other components of the watch that you want to take into account that will determine not only how it wears on your wrist, but how it will look to other people as you're walking around wearing it. First is case size, and this one is obvious and is a great starting point to get a sense of how a watch will fit on your wrist. However, I think buying just on case size alone is a mistake, and I'll mention why in a moment. However, as much as I would recommend not buying a watch based on the case size, here's a quick overview to just kind of get a general sense of how watches should fit depending on how big your wrist is, comparing it to the actual case size of the watch. So just a quick run through, if your wrist is 6 inches, I'd recommend watches between 33 and 38 millimeters. That will be really your sweet spot. If you have a 7-inch wrist, watches with a 38 to 42 millimeter will probably be your sweet spot. And if you have an 8-inch wrist or higher, you're really gonna be wanting to look at that 42 to 46 millimeter range as your sweet spot. Of course, this overview is not foolproof by any means, and I'd go even a step further and say that case diameter, case size is certainly not the most important thing to consider, like I mentioned earlier. Other things that you want to factor in are the crown of the watch, if you have a chronograph with pushers, and the case height of the watch, as well as the lug to lug or band width, because that is going to really factor in the proportions and how it's going to wear on your wrist. However, if I had to argue the most important thing to consider that determines how a watch will fit on your wrist, that is the lug to lug height. In other words, the distance from the most northern point of the lug on the top of the watch to the southernmost point of the lug at the bottom of the watch. If you can determine what millimeter height works best for you, then that will be an unbelievable step in getting your watches to fit better. Why this is so important is for a couple of reasons. First, going back to my point about case size not being the #1 factor, it is because case size does not tell the whole story, since some 35 millimeter watches actually wear bigger than, say, a 40 millimeter watch would, and I actually have an example of that in my collection. As an example, let's take a look at two of my watches. So I have my Nomos Orion, it is a 35 millimeter watch, and then my Young Hands Maxwell Chronoscope, which is a 40 millimeter watch. On paper, you would think that because the Young Hands has a 5 millimeter larger case, that it would obviously be the bigger watch on the wrist. However, because of its long lugs, the Nomos actually is technically longer, as it has a 45 millimeter lug to lug height, and the Young Hands Maxwell Chronoscope has a 44 millimeter case height. Although it depends on the watch, I think you always want to make sure that a watch is never extending beyond your wrist. Similar to a suit, if a guy gets a suit that fits poorly in the shoulders, it's wearing too big, it will appear as if he is even smaller than he actually is. The same can be said for watches. If a slimmer guy goes ahead and buys a watch that is too big for his wrist, it's only gonna make his wrist look even punier. And since a watch is so close to a joint, a poor fitting watch will only dramatize this further, as our eyes are really drawn to joints on our body, and it really throws off the proportions when we are thinking about style. And finally, one last thing that I will throw at you guys that will really dramatically change how a watch will wear on your wrist is the band. If you go for a NATO strap or a leather band rather than a metal bracelet, it's going to wear much slimmer on the wrist. If you want your watch to have more of a presence, it's going to throw off all the proportions, and it's going to affect how the watch wears if you go with a metal bracelet. So just another thing to consider. If you do have smaller wrists, leather straps, NATO straps are probably going to be your friend. If you're on the other side, you might want to go ahead and look at a metal bracelet or a mesh bracelet as an example. Of course, this is all just my opinion. However, if you are trying to look your best, I think it's important to find a watch that fits so that you can come off in the best manner you possibly can. So guys, what do you think of these tips? Also, be sure to do a little bit of digging when you're looking at the different dimensions of a watch. Not all retailers mention these in their basic descriptions, so run around on forums, do what you have to do to figure it out. But guys, thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to give it a thumbs up. Be sure to subscribe. Also hit that bell icon so you know when I release content. Be sure to follow me on Instagram. We have a watch giveaway coming up where I will be announcing the winner on there. The watch itself is going to be a Timex Marlin Blackout Edition. So if you want to win that, fill out the form down below. Be sure to follow me on Instagram. That's where I'm going to be announcing the winner. Lastly, we have a Patreon. If you want to support just this new generation of watch lovers that we're trying to foster here, please, any support would be so welcome, and we have a great list of perks as well on the Patreon page. So guys, thank you so much for watching. Be well, and I will see you all very soon.